tiny little nudge. Tiny little nudge. Tiny little nudge. To a. So one way to see why the derivative is different at different points is that if you draw that little triangle right at different locations on this, you see that the ratio of the height of the triangle over the width of the triangle is very different at different points on the curve. So here, the slope is equal to 4 when a is equal to 2, but is equal to 10 when a is equal to 5. Now, if you pull up a calculus textbook will tell you that ddA of f of a, so f of a is equal to a squared, so that's ddA of a squared. One of the formulas you find in the calculus textbook is that this thing, the slope of the function a squared, is equal to 2a. Not going to prove this, but the way you find this out is that you open up a calculus textbook to the table of formulas, and it'll tell you the derivative of a squared is equal to 2a. And indeed, this is consistent with what we've worked out. Namely, when a is equal to 2, the slope of the function 2a is 2 times 2 is therefore equal to 4. And when a is equal to 5, then the slope of the function 2 times a is 2 times 5 is equal to 10. So if you ever pull up a calculus textbook and you see this formula, that the derivative of a squared is equal to 2a, all that means is that for any given value of a, if you nudge it upward by 0.001, or really a tiny little value, you would expect f of a to go up by 2a. That is the slope, or the derivative, times however much you had nudged to the right the value of a. Now, one tiny little detail, I had used these approximate symbols here, and this wasn't exactly 4.04, there's an extra 0.001 hanging out there. It turns out that this extra 0.001, this little thing here, is because we were nudging a to the right by 0.001. If we're instead nudging it to the right by this infinitesimally small value, then this extra error term will go away, and you find that the amount that f of a goes up is exactly equal to the derivative times the amounts that you nudge a to the right. And the reason why it's not 4.004 exactly is because derivatives are defined using these infinitesimally small nudges to a rather than 0.001, which is not, while 0.001 is small, is not infinitesimally small. So that's why the amount that f of a went up isn't exactly given by the formula, but is only kind of approximately given by the derivative. To wrap up this video, let's just go through a few more quick examples. The example you've already seen is that if f of a equals a squared, then the calculus textbook's formula table will tell you that the derivative is equal to 2a. And so the example we went through was that if a is equal to 2, f of a equals 4. And if we nudge a so it's a little bit bigger, then f of a is about 4.04. And so f of a went up 4 times as much. And indeed, when a is equal to 2, the derivative is equal to 4. Let's look at some other examples. Let's say instead that f of a is equal to a cubed. If you go to a calculus textbook and look up the table of formulas, you see that the slope of this function, again, the derivative of this function, is equal to 3a squared. So you can get this formula out of a calculus textbook. So what this means, so the way to interpret this is as follows. Let's take a equals 2 as an example again. So f of a, or a cubed, is equal to 8 that's 2 to the power 3. So if we give a tiny little nudge, you find that f of a is about 8.012. And feel free to check this. Take 2.001 to the power of 3, you find that it's very close to 8.012. And indeed, when a is equal to 2, that's 3 times 2 squared. That's equal to 3 times 4, which is equal to 12. In this video, I want to show you a slightly more complex example where the slope of the function can be different at different points of the function. Let's start with an example. Here I plotted the function f of a equals a squared. Formula table will tell you that the derivative is equal to 2a, about 4.04, and so f of a went up. Let's look at some other examples. Let's say instead that f of a formulas, you see that the slope of this function, again the derivative of this function, is equal to 3a squared. So you can get this formula out of a calculus textbook. So what this means, so the way to interpret this is as follows. Let's take a equals 2 as an example again. So f of a, or a cubed, is equal to 8, that's 2 to the power 3. So if we give a tiny little nudge, you find that f of a is about 8.012. And feel free to check this. Take 2.001 to the power of 3, you find that it's very close to 8.012. And indeed, when a is equal to 2, that's 3 times 2 squared. That's equal to 3 times 4, which is equal to 12. So the derivative formula predicts that if you nudge a to the right by a tiny little bit, f of a should go up 12 times as much. And indeed, this is
तो इन्होंने बताया कि जो डेरिवेटिव ऑफ फंक्शन है ना, जो द अगर मान लो हमारा फंक्शन है एफ ऑफ ए स्क्वायर, ठीक है। अब हम इसका डेरिवेटिव लेते हैं। अगर हम इसका डेरिवेटिव करते हैं तो हो जाता है, मैं डेरिवेटिव बताता हूँ कैसे होता है। जो पावर होती है वो आगे आ जाती है, और जो जिसकी पावर से हम लाते हैं, जो वेरिएबल है उसमें से पावर -1 हो जाती है, तो इसकी 1 हो गई। तो ए की पावर 1 तो ए ही हुआ, तो 2a आ गया। और ये अब मान लो कि 2a, अब हमारा ए हमने मान लो कि ए हमने 2 ले लिया, तो एफ ऑफ ए हो गया 4, ठीक है। तो अब ये डेरिवेटिव फंक्शन बताता क्या है। अब मान लो कि हम कुछ भी इसके अंदर चेंज करते हैं, पहले हमने 2 लिया, अब 2.001 लिया, तो अब हम हल्का सा भी वेरिएबल को ट्वर्क करते हैं तो हमारा चेंज आएगा इतना। मतलब वेरिएबल में हमारा चेंज होगा उसका 4 टाइम्स। अब मान लो कि हमने 2.001 लिया, अब एफ ऑफ ए कितना हो जाएगा, 4.004। हमारा उसमें 4 टाइम्स चेंज आया, मतलब जो चेंज आया वो 4 टाइम्स आया। ऐसे ही ए क्यूब में लिया इन्होंने। स्क्रॉल करते हैं, एक और एग्जांपल जैसे समझना हो। एफ ऑफ ए इज इक्वल टू ए क्यूब, ठीक है। अब इसका हम डेरिवेटिव लेते हैं पहले। एफ ऑफ ए 3 आ गया, पावर में से 1 माइनस 3a², ठीक है। अब अगर हमने ई की वैल्यू 2 ली तो वैसे 8 आता एफ ऑफ ए। अब हम डेरिवेटिव के साथ करते हैं, जो इसमें चेंज आएगा अगर हम कुछ भी वैल्यू चेंज, जो स्लोप होती है कुछ वो चेंज होता है। तो अगर हमने हल्का सा भी चेंज किया तो कितना आएगा, 3 × 4 12, ठीक है। तो अब हम पहले एफ ऑफ ए हमारा 8 है। अब ए की इसमें ए की वैल्यू हमने 2 ली थी, ठीक है। अब ए की वैल्यू हमने 2.001 ली, तो इसमें चेंज कितना आएगा, 8.012, हमारा 12 टाइम्स चेंज आएगा। तो बेसिकली डेरिवेटिव का ये काम है कि इसमें हमारा चेंज बताना कि कितना चेंज आएगा विद रिस्पेक्ट टू द डेरिवेटिव।
True, when a went up by 0.001, f of a went up 12 times as much by 0.012. Just one last example, and then we'll wrap up. Let's say the f of a is equal to the log function, right? So I'm going to write log of a, and I'm going to use this as the base e logarithm. So some people write that as ln of a. So if you go to a calculus textbook, you find that when you take the derivative of log of a, right, so this is a function that I guess looks like that. The slope of this function is given by 1 over a. So the way to interpret this is that if a is any value, again, let's just keep using a equals 2 as an example, and you nudge a to the right by 0.001, you would expect f of a to go up by 1 over a, that is by the derivative, times the amount that you increased a. So in fact, if you pull up a calculator, you find that if a is equal to 2, f of a is about 0.69315, and if you increase a to 2.001, then f of a is about 0.69365. So it's gone up by 0.0005. And indeed, if you look at the formula for the derivative, when a is equal to 2, ddA f of a is equal to 1/2. So this derivative formula predicts that if you bump up a by 0.001, you would expect f of a to go up by only 1/2 as much, and 1/2 of 0.001 is 0.0005, which is exactly what we got, right? That when a goes up by 0.001, going from a equals 2 to a equals 2.001, f of a goes up by half as much, so it ends up going up by approximately 0.0005. So if you draw that little triangle, if you will, is that if on the horizontal axis this goes up by 0.001, on the vertical axis log of a goes up by half of that, so 0.0005. And so that 1 over a, or 1/2 in this case, when a is equal to 2, that's just the slope of this line when a is equal to 2. So that's it for derivatives. There are just two take-home messages from this video. First is that the derivative of a function just means the slope of a function, and the slope of a function can be different at different points on the function. In our first example, where f of a equals 3a, that was a straight line, the derivative was the same everywhere, it was 3 everywhere. But for other functions like f of a equals a squared or f of a equals log of a, the slope of the line varies, and so the slope or the derivative can be different at different points on the curve. So that's the first takeaway. Derivative just means slope of a line. Second takeaway is that if you want to look up the derivative of a function, you can flip open your calculus textbook or look up Wikipedia and often get a formula for the slope of these functions at different points. So that, I hope you have an intuitive understanding of derivatives or of slopes of lines. Let's go on to the next video. We'll start to talk about the computation graph and how to use that to compute derivatives of more complex functions. You've heard me say that the computations of a neural network are organized in terms of a forward pass or a forward propagation step in which we compute the output of the neural network, followed by a backward pass or a back propagation step which we use to compute gradients or compute derivatives. The computation graph explains why it is organized this way. In this video, we'll go through an example. In order to illustrate the computation graph, let's use a simpler example than logistic regression or a full-blown neural network. Let's say that we're trying to compute a function, j, which is a function of three variables a, b, and c, and let's say that function is 3 times a plus b times c. Computing this function actually has three distinct steps. The first is you need to compute what is b times c, and let's say we store that in a variable called u, so u is equal to b times c, and then you might compute v, which is equal to a times u, so let's say this is v, and then finally your output j is 3 times v, so this is your final function j that you're trying to compute. We can take these three steps and draw them in a computation graph as follows. Let's say I draw your three variables a, b, and c here. So the first thing we did was compute u equals b times c. So I'm going to put a rectangular box around that, and so the inputs to that are b and c. And then you might have v equals a plus u. So the inputs to that are v, so the inputs to that are u, which we just computed together with a, And then finally, we have j equals 3 times b. So as a counterexample, if a equals 5, b equals 3, and c equals 2, then u equals bc would be 6, v equals a plus u would be 5 plus 6 is 11, j is 3 times that, so j is equal to 33. And indeed, hopefully you can verify that, this is 3 times 5 plus 3 times 2, and if you expand that out, you actually get 33 as the value of j. So the computation graph comes in handy when there is some distinguished or some special output variable, such as j in this case, that you want to optimize. And in the case of a logistic regression, j is of course the cost function that we're trying to minimize. And what was 3 times 5 plus 3 times 2, and if you expand that out, you actually get 33 as the value of j. So the computation graph comes in handy when there is some distinguished or some special output variable, such as j in this case, that you want to optimize. And in the case of a logistic regression, j is of course the cost function that we're trying to minimize. And what we're seeing in this little example is that through a left to right pass, you can compute the value of j. And what we'll see in the next couple slides is that in order to compute derivatives, it will be a right to left pass like this, kind of going in the opposite direction as the blue arrows. That would be most natural for computing the derivatives. So to recap, the computation graph organizes the computation.
ओके, सो कंप्यूटेशनल ग्राफ्स हमारा है कि इन्होंने जैसे बताया कि पहले एक बार हम पेन ले लिए अच्छा सा कोई जे ए कॉमा बी कॉमा सी, एक इक्वेशन ले ली 3a प्लस बी, सी। अब हम जो ये जो सेकंड वेरिएबल है इसको हम क्या लिख सकते हैं, मतलब हमने एक नया वेरिएबल ले लिया v उसके अंदर हमने इसकी वैल्यू डाल दी, ठीक है। और हम v, फिर अब j की वैल्यू क्या, 3, j की वैल्यू अब क्या हो गई 3a प्लस वी। अब a प्लस वी को हम क्या लिख सकते हैं, a प्लस वी को हमने लिख दिया u, a प्लस वी को हमने लिख दिया u, तो j की वैल्यू हो गई 3u, ठीक है। अब ये कंप्यूटेशनल ग्राफ में क्या होता है कि हम ना पूरे इक्वेशन को नंबर ऑफ स्टेप्स में डिवाइड कर देते हैं ताकि हम उसको सॉल्व कर पाएँ, ठीक है, जैसे कि हमने यहाँ पे किया, पर इन अ लॉट ईजियर वे। तो यहाँ पे हम क्या कर सकते हैं, हम जैसे इस एग्जांपल में ले लें a की वैल्यू 5, b की वैल्यू 3, c की वैल्यू 2, ठीक है। अब v की वैल्यू शुरू में हमने क्या ली थी, b डॉट सी, बी मल्टीप्लाई बाई सी, ठीक है। उसको एक बॉक्स में बंद किया। पहले हम सबसे पहले इक्वेशन जब सॉल्व करेंगे तो सबसे पहले यही सॉल्व करेंगे, और फिर हम सॉल्व करेंगे u इज इक्वल टू a प्लस वी, जो a प्लस वी था ये, और v की वैल्यू ऐसे आएगी, ठीक है, जो कि हम ऐसे सॉल्व करेंगे। अब इसको मैं थोड़ा और अब जो लास्ट में j की वैल्यू है वो कैसे कैलकुलेट करेंगे, 3u। तो अब a की वैल्यू यहाँ पे भी जाएगी, b की वैल्यू यहाँ पे जाएगी, c की वैल्यू यहाँ पे जाएगी, ठीक है। तो ऐसे ये पूरा इक्वेशन कैलकुलेट होगा सबसे। तो मेन हमारी इक्वेशन ये है। तो कंप्यूटेशनल ग्राफ ऐसे काम करता है आई थिंक कि पूरे इक्वेशन को नंबर ऑफ स्टेप्स में डिवाइड करता है और उनको लॉट ऑफ सिंपलर स्टेप्स में डिवाइड करता है और एक एक करके सॉल्व करता जाता है ताकि हमें सिंपलर टर्म मिल जाए जो कि हम कैलकुलेट कर पाए।
For computing the derivatives. So to recap, the computation graph organizes the computation with this blue arrow left to right computation. Let's defer to the next video how you can do the backward red arrow right to left computation of the derivatives. Let's go on to the next video.
One step of backward propagation computation will yield to final output. Backward graph.
Computation of the derivatives. Let's go on to the next video.
इसको भी हम नोट कर लेते हैं। One step of backward propagation. जो बैकवर्ड प्रोपोगेशन है वो फाइनल आउटपुट यील्ड करते कंप्यूटेशन ग्राफ को, ठीक है। बैकवर्ड अच्छा फर्स्ट स्टेप जो है बैकवर्ड प्रोपोगेशन का वो फाइनल स्टेप फॉरवर्ड में लास्ट स्टेप होता है, ठीक है ठीक है ठीक है ठीक है।
In the last video, we worked through an example of using a computation graph to compute the function j. Now let's take a cleaned up version of that computation graph and show how you can use it to figure out derivative calculations for that function j. And use it to figure out derivative calculations for that function j. So here's a computation graph. Let's say you want to compute the derivative of j with respect to v. So what is that? Well, this says if we were to take this value of v and change it a little bit, how would the value of j change? Well, j is defined as 3 times v, and right now v is equal to 11. So if we were to bump up v by a little bit to 11.001, then j, which is 3v, so currently 33, will get bumped up to 33.003. So here we've increased v by 0.001, and the net result of that is that j goes up 3 times as much. So the derivative of j with respect to v is equal to 3, because the increase in j is 3 times the increase in v, because the increase in j is 3 times v is equal, goes up 3 times as much. So the derivative of j with respect to v is equal to 3, because the increase in j is 3 times the increase in v. And in fact, this is very analogous to the example we had in the previous video, where we had f of a equals 3a, and so we then derived that df dA, which with slightly simplified, slightly sloppy notation, you can write as df dA was equal to 3, right? So instead, here we have j equals 3v, and so dj dv is equal to 3, with here j playing the role of f and v playing the role of a in this previous example that we had, right, from an earlier video. So in the terminology of backpropagation, what we're seeing is that if you want to compute the derivative of and v playing the role of a in this previous example that we had, right, from an earlier video. So in the terminology of backpropagation, what we're seeing is that if you want to compute the derivative of this final output variable, which usually is the variable you care most about, with respect to v, then we've done, sort of one step of backpropagation, so we've gone one step backwards in this graph. Now let's look at another example. What is dj dA? In other words, if we bump up the value of a, how does that affect the value of j? Well, let's go through the example. Right now a is equal to 5, so let's bump it up to 5.001. The net impact of that is that v, which was a plus u, so that was previously 11, this would get increased to 11.001, and then we've already seen as above that j now gets bumped up to 33.003. So what we're seeing is that if you increase a by 0.001, j increases by 0.003, and by increase a, I mean, if you were to take this value 5 and just plug in a new value, right, then the change to a will propagate to the right of the computation graph, so that j ends up being 33.003. And so the increase to j is 3 times the increase to a, so that means this derivative is equal to 3. And one way to break this down is to say that if you change a, then that would change v, and through changing v, that would change j. And so the net change to the value of j, when you bump up the value, when you nudge the value of a up a little bit, is that first by changing A, you end up increasing V. Well, how much does V increase, right? It'll increase by an amount that's determined by dV dA, and then the change in V will cause the value of J to also increase. So in calculus, this is actually called the chain rule, that if A affects V, affects J, then the amount that J changes when you nudge A is the product of how much V changes when you nudge A times how much J changes when you nudge V. So in calculus, again, this is called the chain rule. And what is the product of how much V changes when you nudge A times how much J changes when you nudge V. So in calculus, again, this is called the chain rule. And what we saw from this calculation is that if you increase A by 0.001, V changes by the same amount. So dV dA is equal to 1. So in fact, if you plug in what we have worked out previously, dV dJ is equal to 3, and dV dA is equal to 1. So the product of these 3 times 1, that actually gives you the correct value, that dJ dA is equal to 3. So this little illustration shows how by having computed dJ dV as its derivative with respect to this variable, it can then help you to compute dJ dA. And so that's another step of this backward